Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Free Motion Challenge Live check-in and question and answer session. I'm so excited that you're joining me for this because we have made it through several weeks of the challenge and saw a lot of great designs. And I want to kind of recap where we've been, what we've accomplished so far, and of course, answer your questions. I have found some questions on YouTube, so I found some questions from the Facebook group, so I'll be sure to address those, and then also answer your questions as you're leaving them. If I can't get to all your questions, I am so sorry, but I will try to hop on there and answer them afterwards. So hopefully, no matter what you need to know, you'll learn it. And if I don't know the answer, I'll just make one up and it'll work out great. So for those of you that are joining me that aren't sure what I'm even talking about, the Free Motion Challenge Live Quilting Along is a video series where we work through either a design, a technique, or an area of the quilt, all focused on machine quilting. Now, I know real life gets in the way of our quilting time, and so if you don't have time for quilting, no problem. They'll stay on YouTube indefinitely, so you can get them later and work through them at your own pace. So I definitely don't want to put any pressure on anybody, but if you have been wanting to take your machine quilting to the next step, this would definitely be the series to do it. So we've been through several at this point, and the one that we're working through right now is about border designs and how to turn those border designs into backgrounds. So let's just have a quick summary of what we've learned so far, what we've been doing in this challenge. So in the challenge here, we have been working through our borders, and you can see kind of what we have accomplished so far. So since our very first video, we did the wavy design. We already had a check-in about that, so we won't go into too much detail. But since the last check-in, we dealt with the herringbone design. And this is a perfect design that shows that quilting does not have to be difficult to be impactful. I mean, really all we're doing is creating our little squares and filling them in. And that's a really fun way to give it a different texture, a different look, really fun and easy, but impactful. And then since then, we have came to the wishbones. So the wishbone design is one of my go-to designs. I use this in a lot of different ways on my quilts. In fact, one of these days, I think people will realize I'm just using the same designs over and over again, and I'll be out of a job. But until then, I think I'll keep on doing it. But we're not just quilting regular wishbones. We talked about how using simple echoing would create a little more of a custom look, a little nicer kind of finish to the quilting. Now, I love the way it looks because I think that we notice an unquilted area before we noticed a mistake, and so it just gives it a little parentheses, a little separation from the design and the block that you're enhancing it around. But I also know from plenty of experience that sometimes working through the designs can be tricky. Like, it's one thing to know how to quilt it. It's a totally different thing to know how to apply it to your quilt and also how to tweak it to make it more efficient. I mean, I'm sure some of you out there have unlimited quilting time, but most of us, we have real life getting in the way, so we want to be able to do beautiful work efficiently. And that's why I showed a couple of different ways to use the wishbone design, not just the first one, but also how to apply it. So this was the first example where if we were working on our sewing machine or it was easy to work along the whole area, we could do it at one time. However, sometimes that doesn't really work out. And so we showed a different variation in here. We can see where I tweaked it just a bit. And instead of quilting one long row, I actually kind of broke it into sections and quilted it as I went. Now, it does give it a slightly different look. I think it looks kind of fun and different, but we know I did that because it's easier. I was able to quilt my echo lines, put my wishbone, and then continue again and again and again along the border. So that was definitely an easy way to make it more efficient. Then we saw, I can't find it, but how to do double wishbones was also a fun effect as well, how to return back to where we started. And then we talked about using the wishbones as a filler. And so in the blue panel, the blue floral panel, I used the wishbones to create that effect. Now, what's nice about wishbones is that it uses the boundary of the area as a guide. So as I approach that boundary, I'm going to loop back and go the opposite direction. If that boundary is rectangular, fantastic. But if it's a different shape, such as the ones in our flower panel, then we can use it to fill in that area as well. And that makes it really, really fun. And so what I did was just quilt along the outside of a leaf, fill it in, and then I used traveling to move along. And we'll see this again here in a second because that was one of the questions that came up. And I'm going to address those in just a second. But the number one question was, In the video, you saw me working on the blue flower panel, and in it, I think I said do the cream, or it was on the handout or the quilting diagrams. You want to do it in the blue panel if you want it to look like mine. It doesn't matter though. You could have done it in the cream. It doesn't affect anything. So we'll be using all the panels for all 6 of our different techniques. So you can pick or choose where you want it to go. However, if you want it to look like mine, then you can do it in the blue. So there is that. Now, one thing I want to talk about that came up, one of the questions was, how did I go from leaf to leaf without breaking thread and starting a new line of quilting, which can be really kind of distracting, right? Or kind of, not fun when it comes to being efficient with it. What I would do is just travel to get to the next one. And you can almost see a little line right here where I've done that. So my first move was to create the shape because I needed my space to be defined. And then I started quilting my wishbone, going from edge to edge, filling it in till I get to the top, right? So now I'm at the top and I need to get to the next one. So I just traveled right along my design and continued on. So traveling, quilting along that previously quilted line is really going to help you move from from leaf to leaf, such as in this panel block. However, that's just how I do it. You don't have to. You could break thread if you wanted. That would be fine. And even if your lines aren't perfectly right or perfectly on top of each other, it doesn't matter, especially if you're using a matching thread color. Now, on this particular flower panel, I used a contrasting thread color so that you could actually see what I was doing. And that also means you can see every little unintentional customization that I make. So when you're using that matching thread color, it's not going to be a problem. So anyway, what I want to do real quick before we get into the questions and answers, I just want to spend a second talking about a little bit of a show and tell, a little bit about how I approach the borders of the quilt and how I pick the designs and some examples of what you can do with them, okay? So first, let's go to the designs themselves. For the most part, I wanted to pick designs that were different enough that they would appeal to a wide range of people, right? So we've seen some wavy lines, we've seen some straight lines, we've seen a basic design. Spoiler alert, we're gonna be hitting those feathers soon, yay! And we're gonna see some leaves, and we're also gonna see some brackets. So a lot of different shapes. But all of the designs that I pick have one thing in common. They can be quilted in chunks. Now, quilting them in chunks actually does a really cool thing because I can quilt them as I'm working my way along a quilt. I don't have to necessarily quilt that whole row at one time. So when I'm doing my wavy wavy or my herringbone design, they're touching both sides of the border so I can easily transition out and back in. And be on the lookout for a bonus video on that in the next couple weeks. So it's not, again, not just how to quilt the design, it's how we apply it to the quilt. So those are kind of the things that were running through my mind as I was picking the designs for this challenge. Now, one question or / comment was, oh man, those wishbones, I feel like the panel deserved a little bit better than wishbones. And I want to say the panel is just the backdrop for us to practice these techniques. For sure, you could do some amazingly complex looking stuff in those flowers, and I'm sure if you've looked anywhere on social media, you've already seen some. However, we're just using them to illustrate how we can use that filler to either highlight the whole flower, highlight the individual petals, or to give it a softer touch. So we're just kind of seeing a little bit of all this stuff come out. And in some of the videos coming up, especially in brackets, we're going to be quilting right over the top of the flower. So hold on for that. It's going to be crazy. Now, once we learn the border design, and then I talk about how to take that element and put it into a background, because it just makes it easier to pick designs if you're already kind of picking one that you're already using. And you can do some really fun effects and really fun things that you might not have already considered. So in the challenge, we talked about the wishbones, right? Nice, classic, traditional design, and then putting it as a filler is one of my favorite things to do. Now, in this particular panel, we filled in between the leaves, but you can also fill in between the edge of an area and another element. It really depends on what it is you want to highlight, whether it's the whole thing or just the individual ones here. So let's look at a couple examples of what this looks like. Now, on this particular quilted sample, see if I can get it where you can see the quilting, I quilted a main element. So this is a beautiful swirl chain, and then I have more swirls down here. And in the space between them, I quilted my wishbone. So you can kind of see it right there. Now, this defined area, or this area is defined. It's not a perfect rectangle. However, the wishbone is really going to go back and forth and fit in between those irregular spaces. And it's so much faster than doing those back and forth lines that we learned last week. You might ask, why didn't I just show the easier option first? Well, if I showed the easier option first, you wouldn't pay attention to the harder one, right? It's not that back and forth lines are difficult or even time consuming, but that wishbone, once you get into the rhythm, can go really, really fast, and that's a lot of fun. So here we can see it in the irregular space, but also on the top, I mean, look how long I've quilted these. They're really long and filling up that area, so you can really make it fit whatever space you're working with. And it's the angle of my lines that's going to determine how dense it is. So I made these fairly dense. I mean, these are pretty close together. I was really wanting to show off this element right here, so having them denser did that. But we might use that on a smaller scale. But let's see it on an actual quilt. So here, this is a quilt that I did in the book with Tula Pink called Quilt with Tula and Angela, and this is one of the smaller projects in the book. Now, I'm showing it today because it really has a couple of good points. Even though it's curved piecing, I'm still using border designs or sashing designs in it. Now, we didn't do serpentine lines in this challenge. We're going to see a whole challenge devoted to that one. But even here in the feathers, which we'll learn soon, you can see that it's basically just a sashing. I've just done a little bit of a curve. But the main point that I'm wanting to make with this is right here, I have this irregularly shaped area. I quilted a swirl chain in it, and then to separate or to fill in the spaces between, I did some of those wishbones. And so they're pretty tiny. In fact, when I get to some points, I can't even, get a little closer, I can't even do a loop. It almost becomes a zigzag at that point. So if you find yourself running out of room, just leave off the loops until you can fit them in again and then continue on. So one of my favorite things to do definitely on my quilts, and you can see here another one, nice and fast. Now, when I say nice and fast, I mean it really adds a beautiful look of texture to the quilt. But you know, it's just because it's nice and fast. Now, when I was picking out designs for borders, I had to limit it, right? I didn't want it to make it so drawn out, so I picked 6. But there, of course, are several different border designs you can use, and I'm going to show you a quilt from the Midnight Quilt Show that has strips, and we can look at some other options that you might have for your borders or sashings. And this is actually perfect because somebody had asked a question, how do you pick designs for thinner borders? So let's see what that one is. So in this strip quilt, I have a lot of narrow 2-inch borders. That seems to be common, right? Especially if we're using pre-cuts. And I think it's fun to experiment and use a lot of different designs within your piecing. I mean, you might as well keep it interesting, right? So here we have kind of a variation of the wishbone. It's just kind of a loopy design. And you notice that it works its way out one side, travels, and then comes back. That's a perfect example of a design that's going to return where I started. Then we have this kind of geometric boxy triangle design. This is basically a wishbone with points, and it's a really great way to highlight, you know, the angular look of a quilt. Then we have a wishbone variation here where I'm just quilting some shorter and some longer if we want to give our quilt a slightly different look with those wishbones. And then we have some serpentine lines, which I use a lot. No, we love those. But you can also get a little bit, you know, adventurous and come up with some different ideas. Here we have a little starburst design, a little bit of a texture, and a ribbon candy is a great option as well. And this is one of my favorite designs that, you know, you probably wouldn't think of for borders, those brackets, and we're going to see those here in a little bit. But when you're picking out those borders or backgrounds, or when you're picking out those border designs for your quilt, especially when they're in multiple strips, a good thing to think about is what is it going to look like when they're next to each other? Is it going to create a secondary pattern or secondary effect to the quilt? And in this quilt, it actually kind of does, because I quilted my brackets one direction in one border, and I quilted the opposite direction in the second. I even echoed the opposite sides of the border just to help group them together. Now, this is a great thing to do if you have 2 fabric colors that you love, 2 colors that you want to show off, what have you. So just kind of a fun effect with that. So as you're quilting your borders, of course, I had to pick 6, but there's a lot of great ones. That doesn't even hit all the fun designs you can do with your borders. So hopefully you got some ideas and you can work through that. Now, make sure to hang around to the end of the Q&A because I'm going to tell you how you can win a free thread pack from Glide Threads. But I'm going to real quickly go ahead and answer a few of the questions that came through on Facebook, and then I'll pop on over and see what y'all are asking over there. So Amy had the golden question, right? How do you fix wavy borders? Now, you know wavy borders. I call them friendly borders because they wave to you when you come in. Borders that are too long for the quilt. And it could also be just as hard to fix them when they're too small for the quilt as well, although we tend to make them too long in general. So working with wavy borders, it really depends how much wave, how friendly your borders are. If it's a lot of extra fabric, usually what I'll have to do is just take a tuck. I'll fold it over right on top of itself and then quilt it down. And then in theory, I would go back and use some thread and needle and kind of whip stitch that down. I know that that's just my preference, so don't do anything I say and expect to win a ribbon at a quilt show. Let's just get that out there. If you wanted, you could take it off and reapply it. That's not very much fun either. But if it's a little bit bigger and it's consistent throughout, like it's not one big chunk, it just kind of gets wavier and wavier, you can use the quilting. The quilting naturally sucks up the fabric, and so as it's doing that, it can kind of really suck it up and kind of help make it appear a little smaller. Now, I'm sure all of you have some great tips and ways to handle it. There are a lot of different methods that people swear by. You could use steam to help kind of shrink up that fabric a little bit. Use some steam and some starch to really flatten it down. You could use where people kind of stretch it and manipulate it as you're going. I mean, that's the great thing about fabric. It can be manipulated, so you can use that to your advantage. But here's the thing. When it's all done and that quilt's washed, it's going to be all wrinkly and fun and soft, and so you won't see any tucks, and try not to get too discouraged. It gets easier for sure. I've seen a lot of wavy borders in my day, and usually you can quilt it, you can work it in and suck it in. I will say though, if you keep smoothing that border, thinking, I'll just push it on down, eventually it's all going to be there waiting for you. So if you have a little bit of waviness, handle it when it's right there, kind of ease it back into the quilting, and that makes it a little easier. I know it's kind of hard to see that illustration when I'm using my hands and doing stuff, so there is that. Okay, Lorraine had a great question. Do I turn the quilt to do side borders? So when I'm working on a long arm, it's not the horizontal borders that are tricky, it's those vertical ones. And so some people will stabilize those, take the whole quilt off and turn it, and then work on the horizontal. I don't do that, and it's mostly just because of a personality thing. When that quilt comes off the long arm, I do not want to put it back on there. Usually if it has to go back on, it's because something bad has happened. I haven't loaded the backing right, it's too small, it's not usually because of a good thing. So that's how I handle it, although I know plenty of other quilters that do turn it. So, however that goes. Now, the follow-up question to that with a sewing machine would be, how do you handle the borders on a sewing machine? And since these designs can be broken into chunks, one thing that you can do is either quilt the whole border at one time because you want to just get it over with, or to break it in chunks. And you can transition from the border to the center of the quilt to the border, back and forth. And so that fits my personality because I get easily bored, so there's that. But I'm easily amused, so that works out too. And I don't mind switching back and forth. I think ultimately you do whatever you will do, right? I mean, I always do what I think I like, and you have to do what you will do. So I know that sounds kind of like a brain teaser, but the idea is don't make it so difficult that you don't actually finish the quilt. Ultimately, we want you to finish the quilt. All right, so I'm going to pop on over, see if you have any questions on the YouTube video. I love seeing everybody saying hi where they're coming from. Belinda said, thank you for the info on smaller borders, working on one now and needed inspiration. I think when you are looking at your borders, and especially if there's multiple or it's a strip quilt, I think a good rule of thumb is to pick 2 or 3 designs to alternate between. It makes it easy. It kind of gives you a repetition to follow. And I think that you should pick 2 designs that you feel comfortable with, and then one that's just a little bit of a stretch, one that you're wanting to refine and get better at, so that you can relax during some of them and then freak out during the one, and then relax and freak out, and it makes it a little bit less stressful, instead of freaking out over the whole quilt. And our time to quilt was so nice. You've done so much to make machine quilting accessible to the average quilter. That's so sweet. I just love quilting a lot. And when I started teaching classes, I realized that not everybody loves machine quilting. I know, it's a little crazy. So I'm kind of on a mission to make everybody love it, that wants to love it. And if you don't want to love it, that's fine. There's no class or tutorial or challenge that's going to make me like binding. So there is that. Lori says, what type of quilting machine do you recommend? Do you have a throat size preference? So that's a good question. I want to preface this by saying most people think if they just had a new machine or a different machine, it would be easier, and they're not even using the machine they have to its full capability. So I don't think that you have to have a certain kind of machine to be successful. You'll figure it out, you'll make it work with whatever you have. And long arms a sewing machine, there's some benefits and downsides to both. On a sewing machine, you can start anywhere you want. You can change the orientation of the quilt. That's really fun. So that's awesome. But I will say I use Handy Quilter. I love Handy Quilter. I've had my Avante for almost 6 years. It has, I think, 90 million stitches on it. So I'm seeing how high I can ramp that up. And I'm also a Handy Quilter dealer. So I love the machine so much. When I opened my shop, I thought, I should probably start selling them as well. As far as throat size goes, the bigger the throat, the more you can quilt. However, I think the super large ones are really beneficial if you're using a computer. If you're free motioning, the Mara has a 20-inch throat. I think that's a good size. I mean, you can only quilt as long as your hands are, so if the machine is deeper than that, it's not really going to help you. So I hope that helps. You can also email me if you have any questions and more specifics. I'd be glad to do that. Karen, you're welcome for answering the thinner strips. Okay, Sherry finally get to join a live session. I'm super excited. What would I use? So Janet, this is a good one. What would I use for a scalloped border? Whoa. So I haven't quilted a whole lot. I have done a few of these. Scalloped borders can be tricky because if you don't match the curve right, it's pretty noticeable. And so I would maybe do some echoes and then something different on the inside. So piano keys, straight lines are kind of traditionally what's done. I think that would look neat. A feather would look cool because it can get bigger and smaller for the space. I think that would look amazing. I would probably lean towards something a little bit more traditional or classic. So I probably wouldn't do a funky ferny feather in general. I mean, it depends on what quilt that scallop border is on. That's just me. So you can play with that. But I think that would be a good way to go. And I would just be glad that I didn't have to trim it and do all that finishing of that. Okay, Donna, this is a good question. Why do I quilt so densely? My mind goes towards the space between the echoes, so it takes less time to finish. Absolutely. I think that's what's great about machine quilting and quilting in general. You can make it fit your preferences. I do like quilting it to death, and I'm not sure if it's because I think it looks good or just because I like doing it. I'm not sure. But ultimately, any of the designs that I'm showing you, you can adjust the density by just increasing the space between the lines. That's completely up to you, and it's all a personal preference. It's for that same reason that I like one color over another, or why I like a lot of caffeine. It's just my personal preference. So don't look at anything I'm doing and think that you have to do it. Make it fit your preferences and what you're working on. So why do I quilt it so dense? Probably because I like quilting so much, and it lets me put a lot on there. So, okay, Anita, I did a border with wishbones. I have a hard time in the corners. Each time I make one and turn the other side, it looks crooked. Yeah, don't tell anybody. That's the first step. If it looks crooked, don't tell anybody. Wishbones are a little tricky. In the border corner, you have a larger area. And so when your wishbone goes out to that angle, it's going to be bigger and it's going to look different. It's supposed to do that. That's just kind of the nature of it. In the quilting diagrams for the wishbone challenge, I did show you kind of how to turn the corner with it. I will tell you, my favorite thing to do is to put a completely different design in that border corner like I did on the herringbone, where I just put some squares or something different. It just makes it easier, it takes a little bit of that stress out, and makes it, go quicker. So you can play with that. Isabel's moment, this is a good one. Why is it easier to quilt with poly thread versus cotton thread? I don't think it's easier. I think it depends on the look that you're going for, right? So the benefits of polyester thread is that it's strong, but so is cotton. It's low lint because it's not a natural fiber, so that's great. I like that. And it can be given the sheen like you see on the glide. You can get some different kind of effects with it. But that's pretty much the most of it. Cotton is still, if you get a good quality cotton thread, it's still going to be strong. It's going to have a little bit of a threadier look. It's going to grab a little bit more. It's going to look great on your quilt. And, I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I think people that want to use cotton because they're piecing with cotton, that would be a perfect example of wanting to use it. Ultimately, I use a thread that I have the color of that I need, right? I'm like, I need a pink. I've got a pink poly. Let's use it. So I don't think it's easier or harder. If you have the right needle and you're moving smoothly, you won't have any trouble. So Sherry says she's still struggling with free motion. She brought stencils and chalk and can't seem to get the brain and hands to cooperate together. Yeah, that's unfortunately, when you're learning machine quilting, it kind of sucks in the beginning because you kind of know what you want it to do. Your brain does, but your hands won't freaking do it. And you're like, come on, just quilt what I want you to quilt. That's just part of the learning curve. And if you can imagine yourself when you learned how to write, right? You learned your letters and you wrote them, and then they were all different sizes, and then they became more refined. Then you learned how to string your letters together to make words, and then you use those words to make whole sentences. And sometimes I think people are trying to write a novel when they're still learning their letters. So give yourself a little grace and know it takes practice. I mean, if you jumped on the machine and did perfectly right off the bat, I would feel bad about myself because it took me a while to learn it. So you're really just taking my self-esteem into consideration, and I appreciate that. But I will say that a lot of quilting is knowing where you're going. So even if you're not quilting, drawing through a design, filling it in, practicing how it flows together, so that when you sit at the machine, you're not trying to learn how to machine quilt and a new design at the same time. I mean, that's a lot to learn. It's like learning how to drive a car and navigate a new city at the same time. So I would just say, take it easy on yourself, practice consistently. I would say if you could do 5-10 minutes a day, you're gonna see improvement quickly. It's not the amount of time, it's the consistency of your practicing. And I went from hand quilting to long arming to quilting on my sewing machine, and I had to practice daily. Even though I knew the design, I still had to practice to get that movement down because it was different. But I promise, anybody that's on this thread and watching this video would say the same. You practice, it gets easier, and soon you realize that you're not freaking out while you're quilting, you're actually kind of enjoying it. So that's about all. I know that's not really the answer that you wanted, but that's the answer that you're gonna get. Is there an easier way to use the chalk stencils? I had better luck just by practicing, but problem getting the stencils correctly. I'm not sure if you mean like marking it consistently, or I'm not really sure exactly what you're saying. I do like stencils because it gives you the path, right? So if we talked about learning how to machine quilt and learning a new design, it's like gonna give you that part to take care of. I think sometimes though, when you mark out your stencil, you think that it has to be perfectly on that line, and it doesn't. You're just using it as a guide. It's like a suggestion, kind of like a speed limit sign. Okay, well, not really like a speed limit sign, but still, I want to focus on keeping the line smooth and following that. So if you feel like, oh, it's not perfect, it's fine. It's just a guide. If your question is more like it's not lining up right, I can't get it to go, I would actually mark it in sections. I wouldn't mark the whole quilt out and then load it. I would mark an area, quilt it, and mark the next and quilt it. Because who knows, you might get a third of the way through the quilt and realize you don't need it anymore. So that will help keep it from rubbing off before you can get to it. Hope that helps. Yep, and Vicki, practice, practice, practice. Belinda, will I be designing any more rulers? Yeah, I think you'll see some coming pretty soon. So I'm excited about those. Let's see, a couple questions. Terry asked how to prevent loops on the back with bad tension. So when you're quilting, the loops on the back can be from a couple different things. It could be that the top thread isn't tight enough. It could be that something is, keeping that bottom thread from coming up and moving freely. It could be lint. But if it's happening only in specific areas, like let's say it always happens around this curve of the design, or it always happens in the point, it could be that it's just you're not moving smoothly enough through the design. If the tension is bad everywhere, that means it's probably a tension issue. If it's just a little bit in some areas, as you move more smoothly, it gets better. I will say that the trick to that is just to use a busy fabric on the back and you won't even see it. So I know that's not super helpful, but you can also start switching things out to see if anything improves it. I'm going to change the needle, then change it to a different thread and see if any of that helps. It could also be that maybe your foot isn't the right height if it's an adjustable foot. So the problem with tension is that it could be 50 different things. They're all little and they're all fixable, but it's hard to work through those. And I've even thought like I should put a tutorial together about it, but it would literally be like, it could be this or this or that or that, but you just work through it and eventually you'll find it out. So Cynthia said she made a quilt for her granddaughter with swirls all over. First one to do like that. That's fun. There were some class 5 hurricanes, some tropical storms. Hey, I love that. I bet that looked amazing. And the fun thing about it is when you're done, you just see the quilt. It's not so much about the quilting anymore. You just see all of it. Really fun. Okay, one other question. Oh, gosh, we had so much and we just got, time just flies when we're having fun. How about this one? Cynthia said, when I quilt, I change the thread color on top and I make the thread on the back match the top because I don't want to get those little pokies where it shows up. And so her question is, does it look weird on the backing to have so many different colors? Now, my opinion on that is you can only worry about one side of the quilt. So let's just worry about the front. And I like when you can see the quilting on the back, even if it's a bunch of different colors. That's fun. And I think, oh, I got 2 for the price of 1. And if I quilted for customers, I would tell them something like, I didn't even charge you for the quilting on the back. That's a bonus. If you don't like that, using a busier fabric on the backing, one that's similar to the thread that you're going to use most throughout the quilt, will help prevent that from happening. So I don't think it looks weird. I think it looks amazing, but that's just my opinion, of course. Okay, Joy, gosh, okay. Joy, I want to use 2 threads at once on top. Have I ever done it? Yes, and it's amazing. So using 2 threads to the same needle is so fun. I need to do a video on this because what happens is as that thread twists, you get a hint of one color and then the next, and it just gives the quilt a really cool shading. Now this is something that I would do like for an art quilt or like for a wall hanging or something where I want to put a little emphasis somewhere else. But usually the question that comes after that is, well, what about variegated thread? And variegated thread does that as well, but this is if I'm using like a light medium and a light yellow and a medium yellow. Like it's more of a shading effect, not a color change. If you use 2 drastically different colors, it's just gonna look weird. So I'm thinking more of a shading, like sometimes it gets a little darker and sometimes a little lighter. So Bonnie, I think you're amazing. And Kevin, thank you. You guys are too nice. I'm not doing all this so you can say nice things, but I do like the nice things. Now, how about something fun? I have teamed up with Glide Thread, pull the camera, to do a giveaway. So they have sent me a bunch of spools of thread so I can do little giveaways with the thread. And I told them, I said, oh, let's send some of your other stuff so we can try it out. So they're Cairo quilt, they're PermaSoft. So these would work for piecing and stitching, and so I'm doing a giveaway for these. So how you can win, the details are below in the description box. There's 3 ways you can win. You can subscribe to the email newsletter. I'm just going to pick a random email subscriber. You could also join the Facebook group and post a picture of your quilting. So this is kind of like where you say, look what I did, what do you think? And people are so encouraging. It's like show and tell. And so you can join the Facebook group and do that, or you can go on Instagram and post a picture using the hashtag FMQ challenge. That's in the description box below as well. So you can do that as well. And I'll be drawing the name April 1st. It's not an April Fool's joke, I promise. That's just when the next challenge starts. And then the next week we'll have another giveaway as well. So I got plenty of thread to give away because I love the threads. Okay, well next week the next video, we're gonna be seeing leaves. And we're not gonna just learn how to put leaves in a border. We'll see how to do it as a filler in the background, but I'm going to show you how you can create your own leafy border designs or create your own border designs with any kind of design. So this is going to be really fun, a little bit out there, and I can't wait to hear what you think about it and how it goes. Well, thank you so much, and I will see you soon with another check-in, another video, and I can't tell you how much I appreciate you all following along. Happy quilting. We'll see you soon.